Well, grain prices worldwide have risen dramatically since Russia pulled out of the Ukrainian grain deal. Now, Western officials are looking to China to pressure Moscow to resume the agreement. China was by far the biggest destination for grain exported under the deal, which was brokered by the UN and Turkey a year ago. About a quarter of the grain that left Ukrainian ports ended up in China. Other big recipients were Turkey and Egypt. The deal was seen as a lifeline for keeping food prices stable globally, especially for drought-stricken countries in Africa. Well, joining me now is DW China analyst Clifford Coonan. Clifford, how important was that grain deal for China?
It was very important for China because food security is a massive issue in China. It has about 10% of the world's arable land, but it's trying to feed 20% of the world's population with that land. So it is an importer of grain. It also likes Ukrainian grain because it's of high quality, and it doesn't like it has some Russian grain, but it only just freed up its restrictions on Russian grain imports because the quality isn't as high. And it's also helped keep prices under control, which are important because obviously inflation is a big factor in China, just as it is everywhere else. So the answer is yes, it's a very important part.
Now, China and Russia are pretty close allies. They cooperate in many ways. Could Moscow's decision to end the grain deal strain those relations?
I think it could have put some pressure on the relationship. I mean, it is a very, very close relationship. When Xi Jinping went to Moscow back in March, they spoke of how their alliance was changing things like it hadn't happened in a century. They're always talking about how they're close as lips and teeth. But some things are important. Food security will obviously trump even this relationship, so the closeness of this relationship. So I think that definitely it's something that could put pressure on the relationship if it goes on for a longer period.
Now, as mentioned, China cooperates closely with Russia, but last week, China's foreign ministry said it wants to improve cooperation with all parties in the Ukraine war. Let's listen in.
China hopes the relevant parties will properly resolve the issue of international food security through dialogue and consultation. China is willing to strengthen communication and cooperation with all parties to build more international consensus and make positive contributions to ensuring world food security.
Clifford, how likely is it that Beijing will use its leverage with Moscow to try and negotiate a new deal?
I think it's very likely, given that until now, Beijing has very much sung from Moscow's hymn sheet when it comes to the war. But now it's taking a slightly more, I wouldn't say confrontational, but it's definitely saying that this issue needs to be resolved. I think it has a lot of leverage there, which it could use. It needs the grain. And also, I wouldn't be surprised if we see a deal brokered by China, because it'll bring international kudos. It will make China looking like it's resolved the situation, and you can never rule out this part of the whole process. So I think we're going to see some sort of pressure going on. We have there's going to be a lot of demonstrations of how close the alliance is at the moment. We've got the Chinese fleet going into Vladivostok now in the far eastern Russian port. There's going to be a lot of demonstrations of closeness, but at the same time, I can well imagine China is going to use that and leverage that into coming up with some kind of trade deal over grain.
Clifford, thank you very much for your insights. That was DW China analyst Clifford Coonan.
Well, the political scientist Stefan Klingbeil told us more about how the end of this grain deal is affecting China's food security and its role on the global stage.
I think what we all understand is that China really very much depends on agricultural imports. So China is #2 in the world. And as we also understand, China is #1 when it comes to this Black Sea grain deal. So this is really very crucial for China. Of course, China can afford to buy agricultural products elsewhere, but it makes a big difference whether those grain supplies are available for China or not. One additional point, of course, is that China is looking at the economic situation of the country in the world, and this kind of world economic turbulences are affecting very much the Chinese economic situation. So this is also an additional factor why China is focusing very much on this situation.
But China is not the only country affected by this. Where do you see the biggest concern for food security now?
Of course, there are a number of consequences for poor countries, for developing countries, not at least on the African continent. We saw that over the last couple of days, food prices went up very much. For wheat, it's between 5 and 9%. This is affecting a number of African countries. We see all these economic and humanitarian and even political implications for a number of countries, including Kenya, for example. This is something what is quite crucial. At the same time, we have this kind of let's say narrative fight between Russia and the West. We know that the Russian aggression is something where we see a number of consequences for developing countries, and Russia is trying to gain this kind of narrative battle. Just 1 or 2 days ago, the Russian ambassador to Kenya, he published an opinion piece in a newspaper blaming the West, that the West and the sanctions is in charge of this kind of situation. And we all know this is, of course, nonsense, but this kind of fight to find allies, especially in the global south, is something what is crucial in this context.
Now, China is calling for further talks between the parties. Could Beijing's pressure help to resolve this crisis?
Yes, of course. China is by far the most influential ally of Russia today. I think China is really outstanding. Other global southern partners, including African countries, are important as well. At the same time, we need to understand that for Russia, for Putin, this kind of situation is something what is quite helpful for him, because he's getting a lot of attention. He's going to hold the Russia-Africa summit just in a few days on 27th and 28th of July in St. Petersburg. And most likely, he's going to come up with a number of bilateral agreements with African countries to present himself as somebody who is saving African countries, saving African economies. So this is something what is quite crucial. And in addition, of course, to destroy the agricultural dependency of Ukraine is something what is very much in the interest of Russia. So what I want to say is China is important in this regard, but for Putin, for Russia, they will also consider other factors.
The political scientist Stefan Klingebiel in Bonn there for us. Thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you.
Martin Keim is an agricultural economist and director of the Centre for Development Research in Bonn. His work focuses on sustainable food systems and agricultural development. Welcome to DW. Now, China being the world's largest wheat producer, but it was also the biggest importer of Ukrainian grain. Just explain to us why.
Yeah, I mean, China is producing a lot of wheat. It's also producing a lot of rice. And for those two grains, it's almost self-sufficient, but it imports several other grains, maize in particular, barley, also oilseeds. And a lot of these grains are coming from Ukraine. So we have to look into what types of grains are being produced and imported.
OK. So could China become self-sufficient in its own grain production?
It couldn't. I mean, China is always trying to be self-sufficient in its major staple food, rice, and wheat is another important staple food. But it's importing a lot of the other food and also the feed that it needs, because China is just a huge population, 1.4 billion and more, which is about 18% of the world population, but it only has around 9% of the global farmland, and that means it can't produce enough of all the food that's needed, so it will always be relying on imports from elsewhere. And part of this is coming from Ukraine, also certainly from some other regions in the world.
Right, so it does sound like it is in China's interest to get its ally Russia back into this grain deal.
It is definitely in China's interest because China is very particular about food security and low food prices for its population. This is also in order to keep the political stability in the country, which is certainly important for China. And when prices rise and there's uncertainty about food security in China, this is a major issue. So China has a large interest in pushing Russia back to resuming the Black Sea grain deal.
And as far as we know, is China trying to do that?
It is trying to do that. It has voiced relatively clearly that it would like to see the grain deal to be resumed. That's a few days ago. In the last couple of days, it hasn't, to my knowledge, renewed this claim or has put more pressure on Russia. So I think it may do that because otherwise China may also internationally look weak when it's saying something, and Russia could certainly not afford to mess up with its partner China. So it's interesting, and it's probably the biggest lever internationally that's there if China would put a little bit more pressure on Russia to resume the grain deal.
So how do you read this situation? Do you think this deal is likely to be revived?
I think that it's likely, maybe exaggerated, but I still have some hope that it may. And it would certainly be truly important, not only for Ukraine. For Ukraine, it's super important because Ukraine depends on its grain exports for foreign exchange and for upholding its economy. But it's also important for food security in the world. I mean, prices have been going up. We're currently in a situation where there's no panic so far, because in the Northern Hemisphere we are in a harvest situation, and the harvest in many parts of the world currently looks relatively good. So there's no really skyrocketing of prices, but it would suffice in one or two major exporting regions if there's a drought or some other shock, that prices would skyrocket and that food security would be jeopardized in many parts of the world.
So as far as you know, is there a plan B? If Russia chooses not to return to this deal, what does the world do?
I mean, the first thing is obviously that the solidarity lanes to get grain and agricultural exports out of Ukraine via railway and roads and rivers, which is functioning, but this needs to be further improved and upgraded. And that's a short-term thing that will need to happen. Otherwise, I mean, it's very important, obviously, for other countries to keep their borders open, for exporters not, to panic and close borders in order to keep prices within the country low, but really participate in export so that the international grain markets are not getting into turmoil. That's what has happened last year, and we need to prevent that because sharply rising prices would really mean hardship for many people in Africa and Asia.
That's very clear. Thank you for outlining that for us, Martin Keim from the Centre for Development Research in Bonn.
Thank you.